Hello and welcome to the latest episode of the Not a Day for Soundbites podcast. I'm your host, Will Barber Taylor. In this episode, I shall be looking at a speech that is iconic partly for ironic reasons, but also because it demonstrated how a skilled Labour leader attempted to deal with a crisis that was partly of his own making. It was a speech that was given as London was swinging and the people of America became more and more disconcerted with the war in Vietnam. I am, of course, talking about Harold Wilson's 1967 speech, the Pound in Your Pocket speech.
The Britain that is going to be forged in the white heat of this revolution will be no place for restrictive practices or for outdated methods on either side of industry.
Education, education, and education.
You start with far-fetched resolution. They are then pickled into a rigid dogma code. And you go through the years sticking to that. Outdated, misplaced, irrelevant to the real need.
We've changed the world before, and we're going to change the world again.
As we mentioned in the first episode of the podcast, which looked at and covered Harold Wilson's White Heat of Technology speech given at the October 1963 Labour Party conference in Blackpool, Harold Wilson's driving initiative was to modernise Britain's industry and technology. He wanted to bring about a scientific revolution in both the Labour Party and the country at large. By 1967, parts of this initiative, of this drive for modernisation, had been achieved. Wilson had, since 1963, ensured that there had been an increase of 60% in university students, with 105,000 studying science-related subjects. 175 million had also been spent on scientific research at British universities, an increase of 75% on 1963. The Post Office Tower, though begun under Macmillan's government, was completed in 1964 when Wilson came to power, and was a symbol of this new drive to modernise Britain. But Britain's economy had, despite Wilson's attempts to revive the spirit of the country and to renew it through technology, and despite the public face of the country being seen as the Beatles and James Bond, and Britain winning the World Cup in 1966, Britain was, at this point, a country, economically wise anyway, seen in decline. High levels of taxation hadn't helped, and had indeed caused many companies and individuals to leave the UK, to go to countries like Switzerland and live there, to be non-domiciled there. However, the worst for the economy was not to come until 1967, when stagflation was raging and Wilson was forced into devaluation of the pound on the international exchange rate. It's not a decision that Wilson took lightly, and in fact it's one that he tried to put off. The reason that Wilson was so against devaluation was because of his experiences during the 1945 Labour government of Clement Attlee. Attlee had been forced into devaluation, and Wilson believed it was partly responsible for Labour being defeated in the 1951 general election, and that this idea that Labour wasn't economically competent was part of the reason it had ended up in the wilderness years from 1951 to 1964. So as he came to make this speech announcing devaluation, he knew that he had to set out that it was in some way positive, or that it wasn't quite as bad as people thought it would be. Beginning with an almost semi-apology, Wilson announces why he and the cabinet have made the decision for devaluation. He explains the secrecy surrounding it and the reason that he has had to hold his tongue.
Since the Cabinet last Thursday took its unanimous decision to devalue sterling, it's been impossible for me to speak to you because of the need for secrecy while this tremendous international monetary operation was being carried through. Now I can tell you why we have taken this action, and more important, what it means.
Wilson's tone and delivery, his lack of panic, renders what he is saying not as alarming as perhaps it might have been had he attempted to address them with too much drama. The matter-of-fact approach allows the listener to not feel as if devaluation was a panic response, but one that was carefully considered. This is reinforced by Wilson's explanation as to why devaluation, rather than continued borrowing, had to go ahead.
Because we had to maintain silence, there have inevitably been rumours, some of them very strong, that we were taking a different course. It would have been possible to ride out this present tide of foreign speculation against the pound by borrowing from central banks and governments abroad, banks and governments to whom I pay tribute for their help and cooperation over these past years. In our view, it would have been irresponsible to go on dealing with these successive waves of speculation by borrowing for 3 months, 6 months at a time, without attacking the root cause of the speculation. Failure to attack the root cause would have meant trying to borrow, this time in conditions in which our creditors abroad might well insist on guarantees about this or that aspect of our national policy.
Here, Wilson is not being aggressive or overtly reactionary towards the European banks that had the speech made today. Would have been the assumption of some people listening, because of course, in terms of politics now, when we think of Britain's relationship with Europe, if a politician makes a remark, whether for or against Europe and in relation to the European financial mechanism and the European banks, it is perhaps sometimes over-interpreted than perhaps it was during the 1960s. Rather, he is calmly and coolly explaining why Britain cannot continue to borrow from banks abroad as a means of keeping the government and the economy moving. Wilson then goes on to explain how the restrictions placed on the British economy, thanks to continued borrowing, have made Britain straitjacketed and failed to ensure that the British economy grows and creates greater productivity.
Last weekend, the government decided that we were not prepared to accept any solution which placed rigid limitations on the ability of our people and government to solve our problems by our own exertions, that we could not accept restrictions on our national growth, on industrial expansion, on our determination to achieve and maintain full employment. We are determined to break out from the straitjacket which has constricted us under successive governments now for 15 years. A straitjacket which meant that every time we tried to solve our problems by expanding production, by mobilizing the efforts and skill of our people on the basis of full employment, the immediate result was a desperate trade and payments deficit. The deficit we inherited 3 years ago, over £800 million, was itself the result of an attempt by our predecessors to fight their way out of this dilemma by an unrestrained boom.
Here, he's making it clear that, as in 1963, he's just as concerned about ensuring Britain's economy is modernised and that productivity is increased. This is something that was core to Wilson's demeanour and core to Wilson's understanding of politics. He was someone who continually believed in advancement, but in such a way that it made sense, that it was logical. Wilson, throughout his career, was not perhaps, in many respects, an overtly emotional politician. This is one of the things that a lot of people criticised him for, that he seemed sometimes like a cold fish. And those same critics were also quick to point out that Wilson had been Prime Minister for 4 years by 1967, and he had won 2 general elections, one of them with a landslide. And yet the economy was still under strain. So how could it be that this was all the fault of those who had gone before? Wilson counters this in the speech by stating that had world events not overtaken the Labour government, then things would have been different. He was here referring to Britain's domestic economic situation, which had seen ministers turn their attention increasingly to ensuring that Britain could join what was then the European Economic Community. Because it was a great problem for Britain at this time, as the EEC was becoming more of a sustained trading bloc, that Britain was outside it. And whilst Britain was not yet considered the sick man of Europe, the power and the pull of the EEC meant that Britain's exclusion from it made the country less economically secure than if it was in it. But of course, Britain wasn't the only nation to be enduring economic problems in the mid-60s. There had been a mild credit crunch in 1966 in the US, which forced President Johnson to involve the Federal Reserve. Given that these economic troubles would later be overshadowed by the tumultuous economic problems that occurred during the 1970s, they have been, in some instances, overlooked. But they are a key demonstration that Britain was not alone, and that the global economy was also stuttering, that there were problems not just in Britain, but of course in the Middle East and in America also. Devaluation, of course, stands out as a particular moment of 60s economic problems that historians and economists refer back to, and it is greatly remembered in the public consciousness because it was such a momentous event, and also because of the memorable pound in your pocket phrase that Wilson used in this very speech. Wilson goes on to say that he believes that now was not the time to blame anyone, either his own government or the previous one, but for the British public to face the facts of the situation.
I'm not going to go into all the details of the events which this year have once again put us in the red. The heavy cost to our trade and payments of the war in the Middle East, the temporary disruption of our exports by the dock strikes. And tonight is not the time to attribute blame to the policies of the last government or this government, or to unofficial strikers, or to the manoeuvring of speculators at home and abroad. But all along we've had to face this. Exports, even our increasing exports, could not earn enough to meet the successive waves of speculation against sterling. Time was needed to restructure and modernize our industries, to build up our trade. And we've been doing this at a rate about double what was previously achieved.
The articulation of the causes of the crisis that Wilson gives as being one that he and his government had fought against, but one he wishes not to attribute blame to, is masterfully done. It demonstrates Wilson's political intuition. He realises that he must make this national crisis, for devaluation was viewed as such, and was in many ways a national crisis, as a moment for the country to come together. And thus he doesn't want to be appearing to play the blame game. But of course in a way he does, because he's making sure that any listener knows that it was the Conservatives that he believes had caused the situation in the first place. He places emphasis in this particular extract on his government having fought against it and having this upward hill struggle. Again, not mentioning the Conservatives by name, but implying that it was their government that had caused the need for there to be an upward struggle for Wilson. It's this guile, this political nous that had helped Wilson to climb the greasy pole and ascend the premiership at a comparatively young age. And it is seen throughout this speech, his ability to, as we would describe it now, to spin a situation to his favour, or at least attempt to spin it to his favour. He then moves on to describe how, despite the actions of those who had bet against sterling and the industrial harm that had been caused by incidents like the Siemens strike the previous year, that Britain's economy was still overall performing well.
Whenever Britain ran into short-term difficulties, there were some who sold sterling in a panic, and there were others who gambled against us in the hope of a quick gain. And all this, even though our basic position was showing a steady improvement. Take the Siemens strike last year. There was a tidal wave of pressure on the pound, and yet, grievous though that strike was, it did not prevent us, over the year as a whole, from reducing our deficit to less than £200 million against the £800 million deficit we took over 2 years earlier. Even so, we had to take the measures of July 1966. And the problem is this. We, Britain, are a major trading country. And like any business firm, our financial position depends on how much we sell to others. But because we're also an international bank, because sterling is an international currency, it's subject to speculative attacks for short-run reasons which have nothing to do with Britain's trading position.
What Wilson does here, rather effectively, is to talk about how we must overcome these difficulties. Here he's referring both to Britain and the government. It allows the listener to be put in a position of unity with Wilson. And it's a common political trick, but a very effective one. Politicians from Pericles to Johnson, Churchill to Obama have used the collective we as a means of making the listener supportive of their endeavour. And it also puts the listener on their side, the us against them mentality, that it's we, the British people, the British government, against those who have bet against sterling, those who have undermined Britain's economy. And it's a skill that political leaders have always used, and one that they will always do so, because it is so effective. It is a very stirring linguistic device. He then goes on to declare that,
and that is why the international monetary community have rallied round with a display of formidable strength to back the operation. This backing is, of course, to deter the speculators, not for us to live on. And that's why it doesn't involve unacceptable conditions.
The need to point out that the international community was supporting devaluation was obviously to get the British people on Wilson's side, and not to see it as a bad thing. Oh, well, the international community are supporting it. But it also was a need to, show that this is something that we are all working towards, and that we are all going to work together on the devaluation. But the problem is that it is also a sign of weakness. It's a sign that Wilson had been forced into it, that the larger, wider economic community expected devaluation, therefore it had to happen. It is a failure of government. And it unfortunately leads to the rather famous, the infamous phrase that Wilson coined to attempt to explain devaluation in a positive light.
From now on, the pound abroad is worth 14% or so less in terms of other currencies. That doesn't mean, of course, that the pound here in Britain, in your pocket or purse or in your bank, has been devalued.
Following this remark, Wilson then makes it clear that devaluation will help those British exporters abroad by making their produce cheaper and more competitive. He's also forced to admit that this will then make items imported into Britain much more expensive, but rather cleverly turns it around by saying that it therefore makes sense to buy British. Wilson's emphasis on buying British and the seeming benefit that could be gained from it are illustrated through the next clip.
What it does mean is that we shall now be able to sell more goods abroad on a competitive basis. This is a tremendous opportunity for all our exporters and for many who have not yet started to sell their goods overseas. But it will also mean that the goods we buy from abroad will be dearer, And so for many of these goods, it will be cheaper to buy British. Because one of the great problems we in Britain have had over these past 5 or 6 years has been the great increase year by year in imports of goods manufactured abroad. Then farm production will be stimulated. We'll be able to do more to replace food imported from abroad. Saving imports, and still more the export drive, will mean that industrial production will go up. Many industries and firms, which are now working below capacity, will have a chance to get into full production. This means more work, more jobs in the development areas, because we intend to be ruthless in diverting new enterprise to those areas.
The emphasis on buying more natural produce, more British produce, has been one that politicians have been echoing since the beginning of mass global trade. It was seen during times of great peril and necessity, such as the Napoleonic Wars and the Second World War. It was seen during the Corn Laws, and of course, it's seen today in the wake of Brexit. The realities of our interconnected world and our ever-expanding population means that there will always be a need for food to come from abroad. And whilst this might mean that Wilson's rhetoric may appear somewhat fruitless, he was after all attempting to paint the best possible picture of devaluation he could, and saying that goods are going to be more expensive and you're going to have to buy more British food is not perhaps the best picture to paint. It also fits into a wider theme that he used throughout the speech, which is us against them. That devaluation needn't be seen as a bad thing, that, you're supporting British farmers, you're supporting British manufacturers, you're supporting the British economy, which will make things better. It's a strange device, and it was an interesting gamble, one that did not, of course, fully pay off for Wilson. He also makes it clear that British buyers will not deem it acceptable if British traders attempt to use devaluation as a means to up their costs.
I've said that imports will cost more, and this means higher prices over a period for some of our imports, including some of our basic food. And it's vital that price rises are limited to those cases where increased import costs make this unavoidable. Our people will not tolerate traders who are not affected by import costs trying to cash in by unjustifiable price increases.
Wilson is here in this clip reinforcing that he and the government are on the side of people rather than on those who, by Wilson's implication, have caused the crisis. He then makes a point about warning councils about sizable rent increases that would harm ordinary people.
And this must mean rents. The government have decided to refer to the National Board for Prices and Incomes certain council rent increases, and we're particularly after those cases where the increases seem exceptionally steep and provocative.
And it's interesting that for the us against them theme that runs throughout the speech, that he is making a point about rent increases, and that he wants to make clear to people listening that he doesn't want them to suffer, and that those who are, as he feels, acting against Britain's interests by either raising the cost of food or raising the cost of rent would be dealt with by the government, reinforcing, the sense that we're all in it together, a phrase that a sentiment that many politicians have used throughout history. He then ends the speech by making it clear that he believes that the government must ensure that when economic crises happen, that the burden is not borne by those who are earning the least.
The duty of the government to ensure by special measures that when burdens have to be borne, those who are liable to be hardest hit are protected, and your government will fulfil that duty.
What Harold Wilson illustrates throughout this speech is that whilst he is aware that there is a significant crisis facing the British people, one that was in part of his own making, he's also aware as to how to frame it. Wilson was one of Britain's canniest politicians, and here he demonstrates that in a speech that firmly places the fault of the crisis on other countries, on the Conservatives, on anyone else but the Wilson government, and seeks to almost promote the economic advantages of devaluation. It's a bold speech in many ways, and one which encapsulates Wilson's vision of Britain, a modernising state that isn't reliant either too heavily on the then European Economic Community or the United States. Wilson's "Buy British" mantra that we see throughout this speech is one that is clearly attempting to raise the spirits of the British people and encourage them to see themselves as standing on their own feet and not needing the help of other nations. Wilson's time in office would come to an end 3 years after this speech was given, when he and his party narrowly lost the 1970 general election to Ted Heath. Wilson would return to government as Prime Minister in 1974, but by then a great deal of his spark had gone, and he resigned only 2 years later, in 1976. Wilson was a contradictory and fascinating figure who has been reappraised and judged continually since he took office in the 1960s. Whilst it is clear, both from what this speech represents and from what is contained in it, is that Harold Wilson had many great qualities, but also many great flaws. He was intelligent, persuasive, and in many respects a forward-looking politician whose premiership helped Britain and its people enormously. Yet, as I just said, he was also a man of several flaws. He had a reputation for shiftiness and cunning, which is somewhat justifiable, and you can see it partly in this speech alongside his undoubtable intelligence and charisma. Furthermore, he didn't always have the best grasp of his party. He famously said that the Labour Party is all well and good, and everyone is happy when it is rattling along like an old char-a-bang, but as soon as the bus stops, then everyone gets off and starts arguing. And in a way, that was a flaw of his, that he was never able to quite ensure that the bus kept going firmly and that there wasn't these major arguments at every little stop or every little fault. Whilst devaluation was partly the Conservatives' fault, and was also partly the result of trouble in the world economic market, Wilson and his government did make mistakes that contributed to it. And as such, he should be judged as any politician should be, a mixture of strengths and flaws. Yet his strengths, in many ways, outdid his flaws. His government did vastly improve science and technology research in Britain, and paved the way for many more students to go into higher education than previously. It was a government that decriminalised homosexuality and abortion and ended the death penalty. Whilst the economic pressures that would eventually force him from office in 1970 should not be discounted in assessing him, they do not tarnish or outweigh the good that he did. Thank you for listening to the podcast. I hope you've enjoyed it. If you're interested in the University of Warwick's Undergraduate Research Support Scheme project, which I mentioned in the previous episode, make sure to check out the Lab History 1997 Twitter account. That's at Lab History 1997. The Not a Day for Soundbites podcast will return in January 2022 with an episode dedicated to Harold Wilson's immediate predecessor and a speech that helped define Labour's position on Europe during the 1960s. It's a speech that is controversial both today and at the time it was given. I am, of course, referring to Hugh Gaitskell's 1962 speech, the 1,000 Years of British History speech. I hope you will join me for that episode when it is released soon. Thank you once again for listening to the podcast.